Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, where we talk all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne. This time, we begin by examining another solution for hunters not fond of guns, though this one's not as intricate as Simon's bowblade. Fist of Garasha, an iron lump with only holes for sticking fingers in opened. Special hunting weapon of Garasha the Blockhead, a female hunter with a large build. She, who could not use a gun, simply used this lump of iron to punch at beasts. But it is said she made them reel back to a large degree. That appearance was in a certain way heroic, and she was a fearsome hunter. Therefore, that weapon has always been called by her name. And speaking of this weapon's namesake, you probably noticed that my pronunciation of that name was a little different from what you might expect based on the official English spelling. That's because I deliberately chose to emphasize the pronunciation of the katakana used to represent her name in Japanese in order to highlight what I think is an interesting decision on the part of the translators. Before we can get to that though, we need to begin by recognizing the biggest hurdle Japanese speakers have when it comes to pronouncing foreign words. This is sometimes referred to as katakanization because of the way such words are represented using katakana. But the underlying reason for these pronunciation changes is that Japanese speakers, much like anyone learning a foreign language, struggle with sounds and sound blends that aren't used in their native tongue. Consonant blends are particularly tricky for Japanese speakers, since aside from the n sound, all Japanese consonants are paired with a vowel. This is why Garasha has that full ga sound before the ra, because the gur sound represented by the English gr spelling is more of a blend. That, of course, leaves open the question of how to interpret the sha sound at the end of the word, and this is where things get especially interesting, because when it comes to this particular name, there's historical precedent for a different English spelling to consider. I'm referring to the historical figure Hosokawa Garasha, a Japanese convert to Catholicism who lived and died during a crucial part of Japan's Warring States period. However, her name is commonly represented in English as Gratia with a C. So the question is, why would the translation team choose to use a different spelling? Well, I can't say for certain, but I suspect the reason was that they wanted to keep in line with the Latin theme we've seen in other aspects of Bloodborne's translation associated with the Healing Church. This is something I've remarked on regarding the right-hand weapon name for the Tanatrice, which was crafted by an eccentric of the church workshop, the name for the gold Ardeo, worn by followers of Martyr Ligarius and his church hunters, the left-hand weapon name of the Rose Marinus, used by members of the Choir faction, and probably the character name Maria as well. Also, it's important to keep in mind that however you spell Gracia, both versions of the name seem to have the same meaning. The spelling with a C is actually derived from the Latin form with a T, and both revolve around the idea of a blessing with a recognizable connection to the English word grace. As a result, while it may be a little harder to tell the intended English pronunciation of the T in the middle of this name, the spelling is more in line with the other church-related names used throughout Bloodborne. It's a small thing, but I have to say I appreciate the translator's attention to detail in this regard, as it subtly reinforces players' conceptions about the game's world. As for the rest of the description, I'd say it's mostly straightforward, except maybe the final line. However, this is more an instance of my literal translation being misleading than anything. While the Japanese term zutto is used for something continuing to be the case for a long time, it doesn't actually specify that it has always been the case. So one could also say this hunk of iron has long been called by Gratia's name, something I think is at least implied by the official English. And having covered that, let's move on to the key we got off Simon's body. Underground prison, deepest depths key. The Grand Cathedral's underground prison. Key to its depths. In the deepest depths of the underground prison, one man who went insane is imprisoned. He wears the hide of a beast, and is constantly ringing a bell that produces no sound. Endless death to the ones who hear the soundless sound. That description, notably included on an item we receive automatically so long as we get Simon's final dialogue, contains an important set of clues for piecing together what's happening story-wise as we approach the end of the DLC. Since that information is going to be important to preserve in translation, I want to take some time to identify what those clues are and then evaluate how well they come across in English. First, and most importantly, we learn that this key leads to where a man wearing the hide of a beast is imprisoned. Since we heard from Simon that his killer wore the hide of a beast, and we've been invaded by this person ourselves, that means even if we didn't recognize him, we now know that he's the person locked up in the deepest part of the prison beneath the Grand Cathedral. Furthermore, we can recall how when we first spoke to this person, he was not only trying to dissuade us from uncovering the secrets of the Healing Church, he was ringing a bell that seemed to make no sound, despite our claim to the contrary at the time. While we may have been able to joke about it then, though, between Simon mentioning his suddenly being able to hear the bell and the sound that's preceded every one of the invasions that involved this assassin, it now seems clear that this bell is important. This is more or less confirmed by the other relevant piece of information on the item description, which declares unending death to those who, like us, can hear the bell that was previously silent. The idea seems to be that this bell is like those used to allow hunters to cross the gaps of worlds, and enables countless invasions into specific locations in the hunter's nightmare. As part of puzzling all this together, though, there's also an implication players might consider that's been reinforced through gameplay, in the Chalice dungeons if nowhere else. Namely, if we can deal with the Bellringer himself, those invasions will stop. Since we've conveniently acquired the key to where this assassin is located, it stands to reason that our next move should be to pay him a visit. Before we do that though, let's turn to the presentation of all this information in English. Thankfully, the most important of these clues from the original comes across perfectly well, thanks to the clear use of the phrase beast hide towards the middle of the item description. This links up with Simon's dialogue perfectly, even better than my literal version, because the words are used in the exact same order. Nor is that the only nice touch on display. Note, for instance, the way that the official translation goes beyond my literal wording at the end to emphasize that it's not just a soundless sound that the sentence is concerned with, but the sound of the bell described earlier as emitting no sound. This brings out an implication of the Japanese verb naru, which is often used to represent the tolling of a bell. The result is that it ends up being even easier in English to see the importance of the bell the madman is ringing, which, as I outlined earlier, is a key piece of information when it comes to letting players know what's going on and how to stop it. As much as I appreciate how well this all lines up in English, though, there is one aspect of the translation that I don't think comes across very clearly. Specifically, I find the details concerning where to find the madman in question more confusing than they are in the Japanese. As I mentioned before in my analysis of the underground cell key, the way the translators have handled the description of the layout of this prison suggests to me that they were picturing a single cell beneath the Grand Cathedral that holds several hunters. As a result, when they had to work out what to call this key, they went with the idea of a locked inner chamber rather than what literally translates to the phrase deepest depths. Of course, in and of itself, this isn't a bad translation. After all, even in English, people aren't necessarily referring to a place's lowest point when they speak of its depths. Sometimes that term is used instead to refer to a place that's far away from an entrance, and so the idea of an inner chamber, a cell at the heart of another cell, is perfectly reasonable in the abstract. The trouble is that in practice, the prison in the game isn't laid out like that, and this is where I'd say the real problem lies. That is, I suspect the reason this and a handful of other translations are slightly awkward is that the translators didn't know the actual layout of the hunter's nightmare when they were asked to handle these descriptions. This would fit not only with the issue on both underground cell keys, with their names referring to a single cell beneath the Nightmare Grand Cathedral, but also with the confusion over the landmarks mentioned in the description for the eye pendant I brought up back in Translationborne 74. Sadly, it also matches up with my own experience as a freelancer, where any sort of visual reference is rare. Having said that though, I feel like in this particular instance, things actually worked out fairly well, because the official translation remains functional enough that it's not likely to mislead anyone. People associate cells with prisons, and players would have had to run through a prison area beneath one of the grand cathedrals in the Hunter's Nightmare to get to the fishing hamlet in the first place. As a result, making them think about a cell beneath the Grand Cathedral is likely to point them in the right direction, particularly if they've already puzzled this out using the underground cell key they may have picked up in the research hall. Furthermore, I think the phrase inner chamber works well enough as a descriptor that it could still be used to describe the madman's location even with full context. After all, the cell in question is not only located down a set of stairs, allowing it to qualify as being in the depths of the prison, it's also pretty much right in the center of the row of cells, where you'd expect an inner chamber to be. So between that functional description of where to find the beast-hide assassin and the more successful translations I mentioned earlier, I'd say the official English does its job well, despite the translator's apparent lack of access to visual information. Now that we've arrived at the cell in question, though, let's see if we can't resolve things amicably.
Do you hear this? Fear the bell's toll. For only death awaits foolish prying eyes, and the church assassins are never far behind.
You sound pretty confident for someone behind a door I can open. In all honesty, though, I wasn't planning to unlock that door as some sort of intimidation tactic. I was just trying to get a little more dialogue out of Brador, and I didn't realize the interact prompt had gone back to open door. This makes it seem especially strange that I then turned and ran out of the cell, but I actually intended to leave all along. That's because as short as that dialogue is, there's a lot we can learn from its translation. In particular, I want to focus on how well this fits together with the last set of lines we got from that character, because I think one of the decisions made when translating Brador's previous dialogues ends up addressing an issue I had when I was first analyzing this more recent one. Furthermore, I believe that even the way in which I found this group of dialogues confusing can help demonstrate some important things about game translations and the way players experience them. To illustrate this, let's begin by looking at Brador's third line about unending death. As my literal translation indicates, the Japanese version has this NPC call for the endless demise of those who approach the secret or secrets. Though potentially vague, this wording now ties in perfectly with all the other information we've received about the fishing hamlet being or containing the most crucial secret of the healing church, the source of the hunter's nightmare that's likely tied to the horrific acts of Bergenworth, which are probably the same ones that Mad Villager was cursing. As such, this one line in Japanese tells us that we're being targeted for assassination because we're getting too close to the truth the church wants to keep hidden. When we turn to the official English, though, we find a more general statement about death awaiting prying eyes. This was where I initially took some issue with the translation, because for all that the phrase prying eyes gets at the idea of someone looking into something another person wants to keep hidden, I don't think it functions as well as the Japanese when it comes to letting players know it's because they're closing in on the biggest secret in the nightmare that Brador is now after them. As I mentioned earlier, though, what I failed to consider in this specific analysis was the wider context of the English translation. All we have to do is look back at Brador's previous repeating dialogue about fools brazenly roaming the hunter's nightmare to discover secrets better left alone, and we can see that actually the idea that the player character is being hunted for coming too close to uncovering a major church secret comes across just fine. After all, it's only now that we've roamed so far and are threatening to disturb the secret with our prying eyes that Brador has begun to pursue us. So when considering Brador's dialogue as a whole, I'd say that both the English and the Japanese end up leaving the same overall impression. Ironically, I remember initially being skeptical about the use of the word roam in the previous dialogue as well, something that serves to demonstrate a few different things. First and most obviously, it shows that there's value in stepping back and reevaluating one's first impressions about a translation choice. Second, as I've said before, it's important to account for the way information ends up coming across on the whole without focusing in too closely on one specific line or another. However, the third and final thing I think this experience of mine reveals isn't as directly tied to the lines or the analysis. Instead, I would argue that it highlights the discrepancy between the way that the translators likely received these lines in dialogue form and the way the players get that same information. Since the translators probably had all of Brador's dialogue to work with at once, it would have been easier for them to account for how his lines would come across overall. Meanwhile, after first talking to Brador in his cell, players have to get through the entirety of the research hall and the first part of the fishing hamlet before they can speak to him for any new information. The result is a situation that ends up being the reverse of what I was discussing back in Translationborne 86, where players have the ability to look for connections over all the item description text across all sorts of categories after having picked up everything. Here, though, the translators can see at a glance connections that players may struggle to put together, at least at first. All in all then, it's nice to see the translators use the process to their advantage and set up a scenario where attentive players will have more of an explanation up front for what's going on with Brador's invasions. And on that note, I think it's time we turn to his unusual set of attire, because it brings together much of what we've covered in the episode so far. Sign of Brador, a terrifying cleric beast, the scalp of one of those animals. A sign that the Healing Church assassin, the hunter Brador, hunted a friend. Ever since, Brador has worn the scalp of his friend and shut himself up in the underground prison. And the church gave him a bell of death that does not produce sound for protecting the secret. And as you may have guessed from the way we acquired this set one piece at a time, the chest piece has its own unique description. Attire of beast hide. A terrifying cleric beast. Blood-drenched attire with the hide worn over it like a coat. Remove the hide and it would be no more than foreign clothing. Brador put on his friend's scalp and beast hide before the blood was dry. Most of the blood on this attire is from that time. And now that we've gotten past the parts of the attire that are covered in beast hide, the remaining descriptions are fairly similar. Consider Exhibit A. Blood-stained arm wrappings. Arm wrappings stained with blood. Brador put on his friend's scalp and beast hide before the blood was dry. Most of the blood on these arm wrappings is from that time. So that final section is already familiar, but now consider Exhibit B. Blood-stained foreign pants. Foreign pants stained with blood. Brador put on his friend's scalp and beast hide before the blood was dry. Most of the blood on these pants is from that time. As you can see, the final sections of each of these last three item descriptions is nearly identical in Japanese, only being differentiated by the exact name of each piece. In the official English translation, however, they are all exactly the same, and I suspect the reason behind this subtle but potentially important distinction is that the translators didn't have a visual reference for this set any more than they did for the underground prison. If they did, they'd be able to see that the armbands and the trousers aren't covered in beast hide. Also, speaking of not taking visual information into account, you'll see that later on I'm going to regret ignoring the elevator I needed to take to open an important shortcut. But anyway, if the translators had seen that the armbands and the trousers were only covered in blood and not beast hide, I doubt they would simply have repeated the line about the bloodstains on this hide coming from when Brador donned the parts of that cleric beast he killed. Although having said that, it is also possible that the Japanese versions of these items were identical at one point in development, and the translators weren't given a chance to update the English item descriptions after the Japanese versions were altered. However, I still think it's likely that the translators were working without a visual reference, and I say that because of how the opening line of the beast hide garb was handled. The official translation of "the bloodied hide of a horrible cleric beast pulled over the back" reads to me like either an incomplete thought or a misunderstanding. Either the translators forgot to specify what the beast hide has been pulled over the back of, or they imagined that this garb literally consisted of the hide of a cleric beast drawn over a hunter's back. As far as I can tell, though, the actual idea is that this attire consists of the foreign garb with the hide of a cleric beast attached to it like a coat. So probably the most straightforward translation here would be bloodied garb with the hide of a horrible cleric beast drawn over its back. If we look only at the Japanese, though, it's not entirely clear what short phrase is modifying what. That means rather than the literal translation I gave earlier, it's possible to imagine someone parsing the information as blood-drenched attire of a terrifying cleric beast's hide worn like a coat. And since this is the beast hide garb, it would be easy from there to get to the idea that this entire set consists of something made from the hide of a beast. It's only when we have access to the visual information from the game that we can see that this interpretation is inaccurate. So I suspect that the translators were hindered in some ways by the lack of visual information, just like on the underground cell key. However, there's also at least one way in which things seem to have worked out for them in this regard. Note how on Brador's testimony there's a line where the official English says, Brador hid himself away deep below in a cell. Well, literally, the Japanese only references the underground prison in general, but as it turns out, the official English wording perfectly describes the circumstances where we find Brador, in his own isolated cell. That just goes to show that not everything hinges on visuals. Of course, this is especially true of character names, and you may have noticed that I once again chose to emphasize how different the katakana Brador is from the official English Brador. Unlike the name of the hunter Gratia, though, I'm not aware of any special significance to this alternate pronunciation. I just thought it made for another good example of how sometimes teasing an English spelling out of a name or a word put through the process of katakanization can be difficult, with several different right options. To be fair, this can also be true of kanji, since they often have more than one meaning, and we need look no further for a great example of this than the headpiece for this set of attire. Literally, this works out to something like sign of Brador, and the idea seems to be that it is at once an article of clothing that serves to identify Brador for others, and also one that makes it plain for others to see that he has killed a cleric beast. This obviously makes Brador's act of killing a compatriot a defining moment in his identity, and it is for that reason that I think the official English translation of testimony works so well. After all, what is a testimony but something that serves as proof of a past act? Furthermore, if we look past the first definition offered up by Merriam-Webster, we can see that the word can literally mean an outward sign or an open acknowledgement. All of these ideas work to underline how this headpiece serves both to identify Brador to others and to highlight his past actions. Admittedly, I feel like it gives a little more emphasis to the internal meaning as opposed to the external one, but that's actually true of the Japanese as well. We just need to turn to the item description to see it. There we'll find that the final Japanese word of the second line is the same as that used in the Japanese name of the item. This suggests that the primary meaning behind literally calling this the sign of Brador is to identify this as a sign that Brador killed a compatriot. And since the official English translation packs a lot of that implication directly into the item name, it can afford to use the relatively neutral term indicating here instead. So, as I prepare to wave goodbye, consider how this makes it yet another example of how the most important thing when it comes to conveying meaning is the overall impression. Though in this case, it's the official English that's front-loaded with meaning as opposed to the more broken-up presentation of the Japanese. And having said that, let me remind you that if you have any differing opinions about something I said in the episode, or about the episode itself, I'd be happy to hear from you. Your feedback is always appreciated. Alternatively, if you want to hear my take on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, remember that you can check the Translationborne index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.